Vatican City, March 15, 2024. Cardinal Alessandro Torretti had kept one secret for 46 years, a secret about a pope who died too soon and the men who made sure of it. During the blessing ceremony in St. Peter's Square, a woman in the third row collapsed. Alessandro watched Pope Francis rush down from the papal platform, kneel beside her, and lean close as she whispered something in his ear. The color drained from the Holy Father's face. In that moment, Alessandro knew his past had found him. The woman died 30 seconds later, clutching a piece of paper that would make headlines around the world. But what she whispered to Pope Francis, words only Alessandro understood, would never make it to any newspaper. The Vatican called it a medical emergency. Alessandro called it a message. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Swiss guards moved with practiced efficiency, cordoning off the area around the woman's body with the kind of precision that came from centuries of protecting papal events. Alessandro remained frozen on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, his cardinal's red zucchetto feeling suddenly heavy on his silver hair as he watched the scene unfold below. Pope Francis rose slowly from beside the woman, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he made the sign of the cross over her still form. Even from 50 meters away, Alessandro could see the confusion and fear etched across the pontiff's face. Even from 50 meters away, Alessandro could see the confusion and fear etched across the pontiff's face. The Holy Father's eyes swept the crowd, searching, until they found Alessandro's. Their gazes locked for 3 heartbeats. In those seconds, Alessandro saw recognition dawn in the Pope's expression, not of understanding, but of shared dread. Francis knew that whatever the woman had whispered carried weight beyond a dying confession. Cardinal Torretti. Alessandro turned to find Father Martinez, the Pope's private secretary, approaching with quick steps. The young priest's usual composure had cracked, revealing the anxiety beneath. "The Holy Father requests your immediate presence in the Apostolic Palace," Martinez said, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the dispersing crowd. "He wishes to see you in his private study, now." Alessandro nodded, though his legs felt unsteady. 46 years of careful silence, of strategic positioning within the Vatican hierarchy, of building walls around the truth, all of it threatened by a woman whose name he didn't even know. Yet, as he followed Martinez through the bronze doors and into the marble corridors of the papal residence, Alessandro's mind raced back to that September night in 1978. He had been a young Monsignor then, ambitious and idealistic, serving in the Secretariat of State when Pope John Paul II Albino Luciani had died after only 33 days in office. The official cause was a heart attack. Alessandro knew better. The private study was smaller than most people imagined, lined with simple wooden bookshelves and dominated by a modest desk where the Pope conducted his daily business. Francis stood at the window overlooking the gardens, his white cassock stark against the darkening sky. "Your Holiness," Alessandro said, genuflecting briefly before approaching. Francis turned, and Alessandro saw that the Pope still held something in his right hand, a small piece of aged paper, yellowed at the edges, the paper the woman had been clutching. "Alessandro," the Pope said, using his first name as he often did in private, "this woman, she knew things about September 28, 1978. The date hit Alessandro like a physical blow. September 28th, the night Pope John Paul I died, the night Alessandro's faith in the Church's infallibility died with him. "What did she say to you?" Alessandro asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. Francis moved to his desk and placed the paper fragment under a reading lamp. The light revealed faded script in Italian, written in what appeared to be an elderly hand. Alessandro recognized it immediately, Pope John Paul I's distinctive penmanship. She said, "Tell Cardinal Torretti that Anna Bellicourt remembers everything her father saw. September 28th was not God's will." Francis looked up, his eyes searching Alessandro's face. "Then she pressed this into my hand and—" He gestured helplessly. Alessandro's throat constricted. Bellicourt. The name surfaced from the depths of memory like a stone thrown into still water. Giuseppe Bellicourt had been a Swiss guard in 1978, assigned to the papal apartments. He had been found dead 2 days after the Pope, officially ruled a suicide brought on by grief over losing his beloved pontiff. Alessandro had known better then, too. "This paper," Francis continued, "appears to be part of a will, John Paul I's will, which was never found after his death." He paused. "Alessandro, what happened that night? What did you see?" The question Alessandro had feared for nearly 5 decades hung in the air between them. Outside the study windows, the bells of St. Peter's began to toll the hour 7 o'clock, the same time they had discovered Pope John Paul I's body all those years ago. Alessandro looked at the paper fragment again, noting partial words in Latin mixed with Italian. He could make out phrases. "The truth must be preserved," and "Cardinal Villot knows of the finances," and most chilling of all, "Should anything happen to me, look to—" The rest was torn away. "Your Holiness," Alessandro began, then stopped. "How do you tell a pope that the institution he leads may have been built on a foundation of murder, that the very men who had sworn to protect Christ's vicar on earth had instead orchestrated his death?" A knock at the study door interrupted them. Father Martinez entered without waiting for permission, his face pale. "Forgive me, Your Holiness, but there's been a development. The woman has been identified. Her name was Annabella Corday, age 55, a professor of church history at the University of Rome." Martinez paused, glancing between the Pope and Alessandro. "And, Your Holiness, she's not the first. 2 other historians who specialized in papal history have died in the past month under suspicious circumstances." The blood drained from Alessandro's face as the full scope of what they were facing became clear. Someone was systematically eliminating people who knew about September 28, 1978. And now the killer knew that Pope Francis knew, too. Pope Francis moved slowly to his desk and sank into the worn leather chair that had served 3 pontiffs before him. The weight of the papacy seemed to settle more heavily on his shoulders with each passing second. "Leave us, Father Martinez," he said quietly, "and ensure we are not disturbed." The young priest hesitated, glancing between the Pope and Alessandro with the expression of someone who sensed he was witnessing history unfold. "Your Holiness, perhaps security should be—" "Leave us." The authority in Francis's voice brooked no argument. When the door closed, the study felt smaller, more intimate. Alessandro could hear the Pope's breathing, slightly labored from the stress of the evening. Outside, the last tourist buses were departing the square, their diesel engines creating a distant hum that would fade to silence within the hour. Soon, Vatican City would belong only to its residents and the shadows that had haunted these walls for centuries. Francis gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit, old friend. Your legs look unsteady." Alessandro lowered himself slowly, feeling every one of his 62 years. The red silk of his cardinal's cassock whispered against the leather as he settled, and he noticed his hands were trembling slightly. When had he become old? When had the weight of secrets begun to show in the tremor of his fingers? "You know," Francis said, his voice gentle but probing, "in all our years working together you've never spoken about your early days here, never mentioned your time serving under John Paul I." The observation hit its mark. Alessandro had been careful about that, had cultivated relationships with younger clergy who wouldn't remember those 33 days when Albino Luciani had tried to reform the church from within, who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about the suddenness of his death or the mystery surrounding his missing personal papers. "It was a brief papacy," Alessandro said carefully. "There wasn't much to—" "Alessandro." Francis's use of his first name carried a weight of affection built over 15 years of shared service. "We are past the time for diplomatic evasions. A woman died in my arms this evening knowing your name, knowing details about events from before she was born. 2 other people are dead, and whoever killed them now knows that we have this." He touched the paper fragment with one finger. "I need to understand what we're facing." The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light around the document, making the faded ink seem to glow. Alessandro could see more clearly now the elegant loops of Pope John Paul I's handwriting, the careful formation of each letter. Luciani had been a scholar before becoming pope, a man who chose his words precisely. Even in what might have been his final hours, his penmanship remained steady and deliberate. Alessandro closed his eyes and allowed himself to drift back to September 1978. He had been 30, newly appointed to the Secretariat of State, still believing that the church was incapable of the political machinations that plagued secular institutions. His apartment then had been a small cell on the third floor of the Apostolic Palace, barely large enough for a bed and desk, but he had felt blessed beyond measure to serve so close to the heart of Christendom. "I loved him," Alessandro said suddenly, the words surprising him with their raw honesty. "Pope John Paul I Luciani. I had never met a man who embodied Christ's teaching so completely. He remembered the names of the cleaning staff. He insisted on preparing his own simple meals. He spoke of reforming the Vatican Bank, of bringing transparency to our finances." Alessandro's voice caught. He spoke of truth as if it were not something to be managed, but something to be lived. Francis leaned forward slightly. "What did you see that night?" "I saw a good man die alone." The words came slowly, each one carved from 30 years of suppressed grief. "I was working late in the secretariat when I heard voices in the corridor outside Luciani's apartments, raised voices, but trying to remain quiet. I recognized Cardinal Villot's voice and others I couldn't identify." Alessandro opened his eyes and found Francis watching him intently. The Pope's weathered face showed no judgment, only patient attention that invited continued confession. "I should have knocked on his door," Alessandro whispered. "Should have checked on him. Instead, I returned to my papers, told myself it was not my place to interfere with the business of cardinals." He touched his throat where his pectoral cross lay hidden beneath the cassock. "The next morning, they found him dead. No autopsy, no investigation, just silence." The bells of St. Peter's began their evening carillon, the familiar melody floating through the study's windows. Somewhere in the Vatican gardens, Alessandro knew, night-blooming jasmine was releasing its fragrance into the cooling air. These small beauties had sustained him through decades of doubt, the daily rhythms of prayer and service that made his silence bearable. Now that silence was ending, and he wasn't certain either of them would survive the truth. "Yes," his voice carried the wariness of a man who had already received too much devastating news for one evening. Alessandro watched the Pope's face transform as he listened, the weathered features shifting from concern to shock to something approaching fear. Francis's free hand gripped the edge of his desk, and Alessandro noticed the slight tremor that had begun in the pontiff's left eye. "When?" Francis asked sharply. "How long ago?" A pause. "No media, complete silence until we understand what we're dealing with." When Francis replaced the receiver, his movements were deliberate and slow, as if the simple action required tremendous effort. The silence stretched between them until Alessandro could bear it no longer. "Holy Father, Cardinal Villot's personal archive has been broken into," Francis said, his voice hollow. "Someone ransacked his private papers in the secret archives. The break-in happened sometime this afternoon, while we were conducting the blessing ceremony." Alessandro felt the blood drain from his face. Cardinal Jean-Marie Villot had been Vatican Secretary of State in 1978, the man whose voice he had heard outside Pope John Paul I's apartments that terrible night. Villot had died years ago, but his private papers had been sealed in the Vatican secret archives according to protocol. "What was taken?" Alessandro asked, though he dreaded the answer. "That's just it. Nothing appears to be missing, but his entire correspondence, from September 1978, was scattered across the archive floor. Someone was looking for something specific." Francis leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 86 years. "Alessandro, I need you to tell me everything. Not just what you heard that night, but what you suspected, what you've carried all these years." The weight of 3 decades pressed down on Alessandro's shoulders. He had built his entire career on the foundation of that one night's silence, had risen through the Vatican hierarchy by proving himself utterly trustworthy, completely discreet. He was the cardinal who never spoke out of turn, who handled the Church's most sensitive matters with perfect confidentiality. Now that very reputation might be what had marked him for death. "Cardinal Villot came to see me 3 days after the Pope's funeral," Alessandro began, his voice barely above a whisper. "He asked me about my work schedule that week, whether I had been in the Secretariat late on the night of the 28th. I told him yes, I had been working on correspondence until nearly midnight." Francis nodded, encouraging him to continue. "He asked if I had heard anything unusual, any disturbances. Alessandro's voice faltered. "I lied to him. I said I heard nothing, saw nothing. I was 29 years old and terrified of what the truth might mean for the Church, for my faith, for my future. But Villot knew you were lying." "I think so, yes. He studied me for a very long time, then he said something I've never forgotten. He said that sometimes God calls us to protect the church from truths that would destroy the faithful. That silence could be its own form of service. Alessandro met Francis's gaze. He offered me a promotion, a position in the secretariat that would have taken me years to earn otherwise. And you accepted. I accepted. The admission tasted bitter on Alessandro's tongue. I told myself I was protecting the church, that Luciani's death, however it happened, was God's will, and my job was to preserve the institution he died serving. Francis stood and moved to the window again, his white cassock ghostly in the lamplight. Below them, the Swiss guards had completed their sweep of St. Peter's Square, and the ancient stones lay empty under the evening stars. "Do you know what Anna Bellecourt's father saw that night?" Francis asked. "What really happened in those papal apartments?" "Giuseppe Bellecourt was found hanged in his quarters 2 days later," Alessandro said quietly. "But before he died, he tried to contact a journalist. My sources in the Swiss Guard told me he claimed to have witnessed an intervention, men entering the Pope's chambers, Luciani being forced to drink something." The words hung in the air like an accusation 46 years in the making. "The Vatican bank reforms," Francis said, understanding beginning to dawn in his voice. "The investigations into our finances that John Paul I had planned. There were powerful men who stood to lose everything if those reforms went forward." Alessandro nodded. Billions of dollars were at stake, and not just church money. There were connections to Italian banks, to political figures, he hesitated, to organized crime. The red telephone rang again, its urgent tone seeming to echo off the study's walls. This time, Francis answered on the first ring, his face grim with expectation. As he listened, Alessandro watched the last vestiges of his old life, his careful silence, his strategic ignorance crumble into dust. There could be no going back now. The past had returned with a vengeance, and it wanted blood. "How many?" A pause. "Dear God, when did this happen?" Another silence, longer this time. "No, absolutely not. We handle this internally until we understand the scope." Alessandro felt his chest constrict. The careful distance he had maintained from the events of 1978, the protective layers of bureaucracy and willful ignorance he had built around himself, were dissolving with each passing moment. He tried to stand, to pace away his growing panic, but his legs felt unsteady. Francis replaced the receiver with exaggerated care, as if afraid it might shatter. "Cardinal Bertoli is dead," he said flatly. "Found in his apartment an hour ago. Official cause appears to be a heart attack, but," he gestured helplessly, "the timing cannot be coincidence." "Bertoli?" Alessandro's voice cracked. Cardinal Bertoli had been one of the few remaining prelates who had served during John Paul I's brief papacy. More importantly, he had been a close friend of Cardinal Villot. If someone was systematically eliminating witnesses to the events of September 28, 1978... "Alessandro, I need you to listen carefully." Francis moved around his desk, his movements quick and decisive despite his age. "We're going to call Cardinal Secretary of State Parolin. We're going to inform him that you're feeling unwell stress from tonight's events, and that you're being moved to a secure location for rest and medical observation." "Holy Father, I don't understand." "You're going to disappear." Francis's tone brooked no argument. "Tonight, quietly, because whoever is behind this has had 30 years to plan, and they clearly know exactly who was present that night and what they might remember." Alessandro shook his head vigorously. "I can't abandon you. If they're targeting people connected to 1978, you're in as much danger as—" "I am the Pope," Francis said with quiet authority. "I am surrounded by security, protected by protocols that have evolved over centuries. You, my friend, are a single man who has carried a dangerous secret for 3 decades. You are exposed." The study door burst open without warning, causing both men to spin toward the entrance. Father Martinez stood in the doorway, his face flushed from running, his usually immaculate cassock disheveled. "Forgive me, Your Holiness, but Cardinal Turretti needs to leave immediately." Martinez's voice carried an urgency that sent ice through Alessandro's veins. "There are men asking about him at the Swiss Guard checkpoint. They claim to be from Italian intelligence, but their credentials—" He shook his head. "Captain Mueller has concerns." Francis and Alessandro exchanged a look of understanding. The net was closing faster than they had anticipated. "The service tunnels," Francis said quickly to Martinez. "The old escape route from the papal apartments. Can it still be accessed?" "Yes, Holy Father, but—" "Show Cardinal Turretti the way. Get him to the garage beneath the Governorate building. Brother Thomas has a maintenance van. Their keys are always in the ignition. Francis moved to his desk and pulled out a small leather portfolio. Alessandro, take this. Inside you'll find contact information for Father Carlo Benedetti at the Monastery of San Benedetto in Subiaco. Tell him I sent you. Tell him you need sanctuary while we sort through this mess. Alessandro's hands shook as he accepted the portfolio. The leather was warm from Francis's touch, and he realized with sudden clarity that this might be the last time he saw his oldest friend alive. Holy Father, what about the document? The fragment of John Paul I's will? Francis had already moved to his small personal safe hidden behind a reproduction of Caravaggio's The Calling of St. Matthew. His fingers worked the combination with practiced efficiency. I'm securing it until you're safe, but Alessandro... He turned, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Promise me something. If they come for you, if you're forced to choose between your life and your silence, choose life. The truth needs witnesses, not martyrs. The sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor, outside heavy boots moving with military precision. Martinez grabbed Alessandro's arm. We need to go, now. As they moved toward a concealed door Alessandro had never noticed before, Francis called out softly, Alessandro. The cardinal turned back. That night in 1978 you were young and frightened and alone. You made the choice you thought would protect the church. But tonight, you have the chance to make a different choice. Whatever happens, remember that. The hidden door closed behind them with a whisper, leaving Francis alone in his study as the footsteps in the corridor grew louder. Alessandro followed Martinez into the narrow service tunnel, his heart hammering against his ribs, finally understanding that his 30-year silence hadn't protected anyone at all, it had only delayed the reckoning that was now upon them. How fitting that he should be fleeing through such a place now. This way, Martinez whispered, his voice barely audible. They reached a junction where 3 tunnels converged, and the priest paused, consulting his phone's dim glow to check their route. The garage is another 100 meters. Alessandro pressed his back against the cold stone, trying to steady his breathing. In his mind he could hear those heavy boots in the corridor outside Francis's study. How long before they discovered the hidden door? How long before they realized the Pope's closest advisor had vanished into the Vatican's forgotten arteries? Father Martinez, he whispered, how many people know about these tunnels? The younger priest's face was grim in the pale light. Too many. They were used during World War II when the Vatican harbored refugees. The Swiss Guard has maps. The maintenance staff uses some sections for utilities. He didn't need to finish the thought. If their pursuers were professionals, they would find the service routes. They continued deeper into the tunnel system, and Alessandro began to recognize something terrible about their situation. He wasn't just fleeing for his life. He was fleeing from the consequences of choices made 30 years ago. Every step took him further from the man he had been, the cardinal who had built his reputation on discretion and careful silence. Giuseppe Bellicourt's face floated in his memory. The young Swiss guard he had seen in passing during those final days of John Paul I's papacy. A man barely older than Alessandro himself then, with earnest eyes and an unwavering dedication to protecting the Holy Father. Giuseppe had died trying to expose the truth Alessandro had chosen to bury. And now Giuseppe's daughter was dead too, killed for carrying that same truth. I destroyed them, Alessandro whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Martinez glanced back, confused. Cardinal? The Bellicourtis, father and daughter. They died because I said nothing. Alessandro's voice cracked with the weight of realization. If I had spoken up in 1978, if I had demanded an investigation, they would still be alive. They reached another junction, this one opening onto a service corridor that hummed with electrical equipment. Martinez checked his phone again, then pointed left. Almost there, but Cardinal, you can't blame yourself for... Can't I? Alessandro's laugh held no humor. I chose my career over justice. I chose the church's reputation over truth. And when Cardinal Vilo offered me that promotion, that reward for my silence, I told myself it was God's plan. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent 3 decades rising through the Vatican hierarchy, earning Francis's trust, becoming one of the most respected voices in the Curia. All of it built on the foundation of one night's cowardice. They emerged into a utilitarian garage beneath the Governorate building, where a white maintenance van sat among other vehicles. The space smelled of motor oil and cleaning supplies, honest workman's smells that seemed almost obscene in contrast to the elegant chambers where Alessandro usually conducted his business. Martinez hurried to the van and checked for the keys. "Here," he said, holding them up. "Brother Thomas left fuel cards in the glove compartment. You can drive for hours without stopping." Alessandro accepted the keys with trembling fingers. The metal was cold and solid, more real than anything he had touched in years. "Where will you tell them I've gone?" "I'll say you collapsed from stress, that we called for medical assistance, and you were taken to a private clinic outside Rome." Martinez gripped Alessandro's shoulder. "Buy yourself time to think, to plan. His Holiness will work to expose whoever is behind this, but you need to stay alive long enough for the truth to matter." As Alessandro climbed into the van's driver's seat, his cardinal's ring caught the fluorescent lighting. The heavy gold band bore the papal seal symbol of his oath to serve the Church above all else. For 30 years, he had believed that oath justified his silence. Now he understood it demanded exactly the opposite. The van's engine turned over with a reassuring rumble. Through the windshield, Alessandro could see Martinez opening the garage's exit door manually, the mechanism groaning with disuse. Beyond lay Rome's ancient streets, and a reckoning 46 years in the making. As he pulled out into the Roman night, Alessandro caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The face looking back was that of a stranger, a man who had lost everything he thought he valued, and was only now discovering what truly mattered. Behind him, the Vatican's lights grew smaller in the darkness. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and perhaps the first honest act of his adult life. He pulled into a darkened parking area near the Tiber and killed the engine. The silence was deafening after the van's steady rumble. Through the grimy windshield, he could see the river's black surface reflecting scattered streetlights like fallen stars. His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Campo de' Fiori. 20 minutes. Come alone." Alessandro stared at the screen, his blood turning to ice. No one should have this number except Vatican personnel. No one should know where he was or that he had fled, unless... His hands shook as he opened the glove compartment, searching for the fuel cards Martinez had mentioned. Instead, his fingers found something else, a small black device no larger than a matchbox. A GPS tracker. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Martinez hadn't been helping him escape. Martinez had been herding him exactly where someone wanted him to go. Alessandro's mind raced backward through the evening, re-examining every moment with this new terrible clarity. Martinez bursting into Francis's study without announcement, claiming men were asking about Alessandro at the checkpoint. How convenient. Martinez knowing exactly which tunnels to use, which garage to access. Martinez ensuring Alessandro took this specific van with its hidden passenger. But the betrayal cut deeper than operational details. For how long had Martinez been reporting on him? How many private conversations with Francis had been transmitted to unknown listeners? How many Vatican secrets had been compromised through the priest Alessandro had trusted implicitly? His phone buzzed again. 15 minutes. "Don't make us come find you." The audacity of it was breathtaking. They weren't even pretending to hide their surveillance anymore. They knew exactly where he was, exactly what vehicle he drove, exactly how trapped he had become. Alessandro started the engine and pulled back onto the street, his mind working furiously. If Martinez was compromised, then the entire Vatican's inner circle was penetrated. The papal apartments themselves weren't safe. Francis was in immediate danger, surrounded by people who might already have sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. The irony was crushing. For 30 years, Alessandro had believed his silence protected the Church from scandal, preserved the institution's integrity against the corrosive effects of truth. But his silence had done exactly the opposite. It had allowed corruption to metastasize, had given the guilty time to entrench themselves, to recruit accomplices, to build networks of complicity that now reached into the heart of the Vatican itself. Campo de' Fiori appeared ahead, its daytime bustle of flower vendors and tourists replaced by shadows and closed shutters. A few late-night restaurants still glowed with warm light, but most of the ancient square lay empty. Alessandro parked near the statue of Giordano Bruno, the philosopher burned here for heresy in 1600. Another man who had died for inconvenient truths. A figure emerged from the darkness near the monument, tall, well-dressed, moving with the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to power. As he approached the van, Alessandro recognized the face from countless Vatican functions: Cardinal Secretary of State Pietro Parolin. But not Parolin as Alessandro had ever seen him. Gone was the diplomatic smile, the careful deference to papal authority. This man's eyes held the cold certainty of someone who had long ago decided that the ends justified any means necessary. Parolin slipped into the passenger seat with practiced ease, as if he had done this many times before. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual ecclesiastical warmth. "You've caused quite a stir tonight, Alessandro. His Holiness is very concerned about your sudden illness." The words dripped with mock sympathy. "Such a shame when stress finally catches up to us, isn't it? After all these years of faithful service." Alessandro found his voice. "How long have you known?" "Known what? That you witnessed Luciani's murder? That you've been carrying that delicious secret for 3 decades? Parolin's laugh was genuinely amused. "Oh, my dear friend, we've always known. We've been watching you since 1978, making sure you stayed properly motivated to keep silent." The words hit Alessandro like hammer blows. "We? Did you really think Cardinal Villa acted alone? That one man could orchestrate the death of a pope without institutional support?" Parolin adjusted his red zucchetto with casual indifference. "The Church has always been governed by practical men, Alessandro. Men who understand that sometimes the institution must be protected from its own supposed ideals." In that moment, Alessandro understood the true scope of his betrayal, not just of Giuseppe Bellicourt, not just of John Paul I, but of every moment he had spent believing his silence served God rather than murderers. "You used me," Alessandro whispered, the words barely audible over the van's idling engine. "You let me think I was protecting the Church when I was protecting you." Parolin's smile was genuinely warm now, the expression of a teacher pleased with a slow student's breakthrough. "Not just you, my dear Alessandro. We've been cultivating loyal servants for decades. Cardinals who understand that stability requires certain accommodations. Bishops who know that some truths are too dangerous for public consumption." He gestured toward the statue of Giordano Bruno looming in the darkness. "History is written by survivors, not martyrs. Francis doesn't know, it wasn't a question." Alessandro could see the entire conspiracy now, a shadow hierarchy within the Vatican, men who had spent decades accumulating power while appearing to serve papal authority. "You've been using his trust, manipulating his decisions." "Francis is an idealist," Parolin said with dismissive affection. "A good man, certainly, sincere in his beliefs, but dangerously naive about how institutions actually function. He believes transparency and reform can coexist with papal authority. He doesn't understand that some foundations can't bear the weight of examination." Alessandro's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. "Giuseppe Bellicourt knew, didn't he? We know about your nephew's scholarship to the American University, his dreams of studying architecture. We know about the parish in Calabria where your elderly confessor serves. How tragic it would be if Father Romano's heart finally gave out after all these years of faithful service." Each name hit Alessandro like a physical blow. These people had mapped his entire emotional landscape, identified every person whose suffering they could orchestrate if he refused compliance. The web of complicity wasn't just institutional, it was deeply, intimately personal. "You see," Parolin continued gently, "we don't need martyrs, Alessandro. We need partners. Men who understand that protecting the people we love sometimes requires difficult choices." Alessandro stared through the windshield at Giordano Bruno's bronze figure, the philosopher who had chosen death over compromise. For 30 years, Alessandro had told himself that pragmatism was wisdom, that accommodation was virtue. But sitting in this van, feeling the weight of Parolin's threats against everyone he held dear, Alessandro finally understood what Elena Bellicourt had died trying to tell him. Some compromises don't preserve the soul, they devour it entirely. And the men who had orchestrated decades of murder and manipulation were about to discover that their most carefully cultivated asset had just reached his point of absolute refusal. "No," Alessandro said quietly, his voice carrying a finality that made Parolin's confident expression flicker. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no." Alessandro turned to face the Secretary of State directly, and Parolin seemed genuinely startled by what he saw in those eyes. "You're going to kill my sister? My nephew, Father Romano? Then do it, but I won't be your accomplice anymore." Parolin's diplomatic mask slipped completely. "Alessandro, you're being dangerously emotional. Think rationally about rationally. Alessandro's laugh was bitter. I've been thinking rationally for 30 years, weighing costs and benefits, calculating institutional damage, protecting reputations while murderers walked free. Do you know what rational thinking has bought me? He gestured toward the statue of Giordano Bruno, its bronze face reflecting the streetlight. That man chose death over compromise because he understood something I forgot. Truth isn't just information, it's the foundation of everything holy. Every moment I stayed silent, I wasn't protecting the church, I was betraying it. Parolin's hand moved subtly toward his jacket pocket, but Alessandro was already in motion. 30 years of careful physical conditioning hadn't been entirely wasted. His left hand caught Parolin's wrist, while his right pulled the van into gear. "What are you doing?" Parolin demanded, struggling against Alessandro's grip. The van lurched forward, tires squealing against ancient cobblestones. Alessandro drove with one hand while maintaining his hold on Parolin, heading not for the Vatican but toward the one place in Rome where truth still mattered more than expedience. "Taking you to confession," Alessandro said grimly. The van careened through narrow streets, past shuttered shops and startled late-night pedestrians. Parolin twisted in his seat, trying to reach whatever weapon he carried, but Alessandro's grip was iron. Years of suppressed rage had found their outlet. "You think Francis will believe you?" Parolin snarled. "You think anyone will? I'm the Secretary of State. You're a man having a nervous breakdown, making wild accusations against Elena. Recorded everything." The lie came to Alessandro so smoothly it surprised him. Before she died, she documented names, dates, bank account numbers, everything Luciani discovered about Vatican finances, everything her father died trying to expose. Parolin went still. "That's impossible. We searched. You searched her apartment, her office, her hotel room. You never found her safety deposit box in Zurich." Alessandro smiled at Parolin's expression. "Giuseppe taught his daughter well. Never keep evidence where enemies can find it." It wasn't true. Alessandro had no idea if Elena had documented anything, but the seed of doubt in Parolin's eyes was worth the deception. For the first time in decades, Alessandro held cards his opponents couldn't see. The van skidded to a halt outside the church of Sant'Andrea al Quirinale. Alessandro had chosen it deliberately, Bernini's masterpiece, where generations of Jesuit novices had prayed and studied, where Francis himself had worshipped during his years in Rome as a young priest. "Get out!" Alessandro ordered, finally releasing Parolin's wrist. "This is madness. Even if you expose us, you'll destroy yourself. Your career, your reputation." "My career was built on blood money. My reputation is a lie." Alessandro's voice was steady now, filled with the peace that comes from finally choosing the right path. "I should have destroyed both 30 years ago." They walked through the church's doors into candlelit silence. The Baroque interior glowed with sacred beauty, gold and marble reaching toward heaven. Art created by men who believe their work serves something greater than themselves. Alessandro had forgotten how pure faith could feel. He guided Parolin toward the confessional booths at the side chapel, ancient wooden structures that had heard centuries of human failure and redemption. The irony was perfect. The most powerful men in the Vatican, confronting truth in the one place where power meant nothing. "You're going to call Francis," Alessandro said quietly. "You're going to confess everything. John Paul I's murder, Giuseppe's death, Elena's assassination, every name, every detail, every account number." Parolin's laugh held no humor. "Or what? You'll kill me? Here, in a sacred space? That would destroy your soul more completely than silence ever could." "No," Alessandro said, pulling out his phone and activating the recording function. "I'm going to let you destroy yourself." He hit speed dial for Vatican security, then placed the phone on the confessional's wooden rail where it would capture every word. After 30 years of silence, Alessandro Torretti was finally ready to speak the truth that would either save the church or burn it down entirely. Outside, Rome slept peacefully, unaware that the foundations of faith itself were being tested in a small Baroque church, where two men faced the eternal choice between expedience and righteousness. Alessandro spoke first, his voice steady in the candlelit silence as he recounted 30 years of complicity. Every detail of that September night in 1978, Luciani's final gasps, the switched medications, Vio's cold instructions to say nothing, the decades of justification that followed, the careful construction of lies he had told himself about serving the greater good. Parolin remained silent until Vatican security arrived, then broke completely. Names spilled from him like blood from a wound: cardinals, bishops, bankers, politicians, a network of corruption that had metastasized through the church's body for decades, feeding on secrecy and fear. Account numbers in Swiss banks, real estate deals in London, arms sales blessed by men in red vestments. When the Swiss guard finally led Parolin away in handcuffs, Alessandro remained kneeling in the confessional booth. The weight he had carried for 3 decades was gone, leaving behind something he barely recognized: peace, not happiness, not relief, but the profound quiet that comes from finally speaking truth in a world built on lies. Dawn was breaking over Rome when Francis arrived at the church alone, without his usual security detail. The Pope looked older than Alessandro remembered, the weight of revelation etched in every line of his weathered face. They sat together in the front pew like 2 exhausted soldiers after a battle that had cost them everything they thought they understood about their cause. "Giuseppe Bellacorte's family will receive justice," Francis said quietly. "Elena's death won't be forgotten, but the damage—" Alessandro nodded. Already the phones were ringing: journalists who had been leaked portions of Parolin's confession, prosecutors opening investigations, Catholics around the world demanding answers their church couldn't provide. The scandal would dwarf anything in modern Vatican history. "Perhaps that's what we deserve," Alessandro said. "Perhaps we've hidden from accountability so long that only complete exposure can restore credibility." Francis was quiet for a long moment, studying the Baroque angels carved into the altar. "I thought reforms could come gradually, change the culture from within, maintain stability while pursuing justice. But you can't reform a foundation built on murder." 3 months later, Alessandro stood in his empty apartment, packing the last of his belongings into cardboard boxes. His resignation from Vatican service had been accepted immediately, not as punishment, but as necessary distance from an institution he could no longer represent with integrity. The trials were beginning. 12 cardinals indicted, 47 bank accounts frozen, documents spanning 40 years of corruption being analyzed by investigators from 6 countries. The church would survive. It always had, but not unchanged. Francis had announced the most sweeping reforms in Vatican history, opening archives that had been sealed for centuries, submitting church finances to external oversight, establishing tribunals to investigate decades of covered-up crimes. Alessandro's phone rang. His sister's voice was bright with a health he hadn't heard in years. The experimental treatment was working, her cancer retreating against all medical expectations. His nephew had been accepted to architecture school, with a full scholarship from a Protestant foundation, impressed by his uncle's courage. Father Romano had written from Calabria, describing a mysterious donation that had renovated his struggling parish. The threats against his loved ones had been empty after all, or perhaps God had other plans for their protection. A knock at the door interrupted his packing. Alessandro opened it to find a young woman with familiar eyes, Elena Bellacorte's cousin, carrying a manila envelope sealed with Vatican stamps. "This belonged to Elena," she said softly. "The police released it from evidence yesterday. She asked me to give it to you if anything happened to her." Inside the envelope was a photographed Giuseppe Bellacorte, in his Swiss Guard uniform, standing beside Pope John Paul I, just days before both men died. On the back, Elena had written in careful script, "For Cardinal Torretti, sometimes the truth takes 30 years to find its voice. Thank you for finally listening. E.B." Alessandro closed his eyes, feeling the presence of the dead who had waited so long for justice. Giuseppe, who died protecting a secret that should have been proclaimed. Elena, who died seeking answers that should have been freely given. Even John Paul I, whose vision of a transparent church had cost him his life. The afternoon sun slanted through his apartment windows as Alessandro finished packing. Tomorrow he would drive south to a small village in Tuscany, where a rural parish needed a simple priest, not a cardinal, not an advisor to popes, just a man who understood the weight of forgiveness and the necessity of truth. Rome would continue its eternal rhythm without him. Pilgrims would still climb the Spanish Steps, tourists would still marvel at the Sistine Chapel, believers would still find solace in St. Peter's embrace. But perhaps now they would worship in a church that had finally chosen righteousness over expedience. Alessandro picked up the photograph one last time, studying Giuseppe's young face, remembering the earnest Swiss guard who had died believing justice would eventually prevail. After 30 years of silence, perhaps it finally had. The story would stay with him forever, not as burden now, but as testament to a truth powerful enough to survive any conspiracy built to bury it.